Okay, we should start. So thanks for showing up, even if you're doing user testing and like. So what we are going to do this week, well, what the plan for today is that last week we tried to tackle a bit, what does it mean to say that the mind is Bayesian? And we tried to showcase general, like the idea that we can use Bayes' theorem as a general engine for integrating information from different sources, which could be priors, existing knowledge, and whatever input comes from the outside, but it could be also from a plurality of sources. We've taken the example of the urn, in which we integrate direct information, what we sample from the urn, and social information, that is what another person is guessing based on what they sample on the urn. And then we build two models, really two nested models. So the simple Bayesian agent, which does what it's traditionally called a rational integration of the two sources of information, takes them at face value and combines them as they are, which is a model without parameters. And the weighted Bayes model, in which the two different sources of information can get different weights. We might trust the other better than ourselves if they're an expert. We might trust ourselves better than the other because we actually saw the marbles that were sampled from the urn, while we didn't really see what the other person sampled, right? They're in the evidence from them is more indirect than the ones we have. And we've seen that that model had a funnel, meaning that that model was hard to estimate because a weight of 1, 1 and a weight of 2, 2 and a weight of 3, 3 would actually give very similar results. What we're going to do this week, we're going to spend a bit more time on how do we reparameterize the weighted Bayes so that it actually works. We're going to showcase the validation of that model and the model recovery, and then I will show you very quickly how we would extend these to a hierarchical version. Before we go there, though, I've been made aware that I should remind people that next week there's a change in the plan, not dependent on me. I don't know what's dependent on, but the class is immediately after the lecture, and that's in time plan, right? And I checked, and it should be also here. The last note before we start on the content is that so final evaluation needs to be done. I opened it, but usually what I do is that we take a little bit of time in the second to last lecture for making sure that everybody fills it in. And then in the last lecture, we discuss the what was in the evaluation. Not the whole of the last lecture, because there's still content I want to cover, right? It would also be a bit boring. Good. Are there questions so far? I'm actually just going to try to see whether It works better with the lights off. Is it too dark? Do you see the screen better? Yes, great. Okay, so we go a couple of slides back in where we were, just to remind you where we were. So what we were building was a model that took the blue marbles that we see in our hand, the choice of the other, and then tries to combine them according to weights. We're using the beta binomial distribution, which is a neat trick because it means that we can just count how many marbles there are. And on a trial, or not on a trial, and as we integrate the two sources of information, we can simply sum them up. We simulated some data, we fitted a model to that, and we got that the model could not really recover the weights. In particular, it was kind of crap at recovering the weight for social information. We tried to see what's going wrong. Lots of things seems to be perfectly in place, but when we look at the joint posterior distribution of the two weights, we get an ellipsis, which fans out on the one end and gets very narrow on the other end, right? Which is the actual definition of what a funnel is. If you remember, this is a problem for the sampler because the steps that it has to do to explore the space on the bottom left are not good to explore the space on the upper right and vice versa. So the sampler will have trouble sampling that. Also, these tells us that as we move along the diagonal, the log posterior likelihood doesn't change that much, exactly because we have that issue that given that we only observe the binary choices of the agent, we are mostly able to assess the relative weight, right? That one source of evidence is weighted more than the other, and roughly by how much, but not the total weight. Right? We'll get back to the total weight. And indeed, the slope, if we can call it that, the tilt of the ellipses is along the line of the lower weight divided the higher weight. Can't remember what it is. I wrote in the course notes, and now I completely forgot. I'm blanking, sorry. But it follows that diagonal, which is also a nice way to sort of diagnose, assess whether it at least has captured the relative ratio. Are there questions so far? So I usually start very ambitious every year saying, okay, this year we're actually going to get all the way to a very complex model. And then as I try to sort of go through the process, even with the simpler models, all these sort of things happens, right? 1 and 2, yes.
I think I'm a bit confused about, you say that some part of this space is easy or requires different steps to explore. Yeah. But so at least what I'm getting is that, so if you have a social weight of 3 and a direct weight of 3, how would you distinguish that from 1 and 1, 2 and 2, 10 and 10, something like that?
If you have a social weight of 3 and a direct weight of 1, right? So that will produce very different patterns of choices with different evidence level in the two sources.
But the way I understand the issue here is that you can have many weight pairs.
Yes.
The same behavior.
Yes.
Right?
Exactly. And that's where the ratio between the one weight and the other weight is the same.
Then,
Yes.
I think again, but then this point about like exploring the space, I think I have a hard time connecting those to a bit like punch. Does it mean that it's
These are not exactly the same issue, right?
okay?
But they are. So in a sense, we see the funnel. And we can see, okay, here the sampler, even if it hasn't given us divergences, it's having a hard time. So it's pathological. We should see whether we can do something with that. Then we look at the specific position of this funnel. And what we see is that it follows a diagonal, right? Which corresponds to the actual ratio of the two weights that we gave the simulation. Let's say that it was 0.5 and 1.5, I think it actually was. And then we can see that if we follow the diagonal roughly, not exactly, but roughly, all those pairs will reflect the same ratio. Yeah.
I see. So the funnel shape kind of tells us that the space is being explored in like a non-homogeneous way.
Yeah, and that our model is not ideally parameterized. Yes. But as you can see, like there's a lot of cues, right? Because we looked at divergences, nothing, right? We looked at the energy, nothing. Then we looked at the parameter recovery, and we had issues. And then we said, okay, now we have something to go and check. And so we looked at this, and then given that it can reconstruct things, and that there is a funnel, and that the tilt of the funnel is something specific, we reconstruct what the issue could be if we hadn't done it a priori. I can't do that. I just need to do the diagnostics every time. Yes. Yeah, Christian?
Yeah, so it's really a mathematical problem in a way that the model is actually working with a ratio, but we expect to recover some numbers. We are never going to be able to recover those numbers. Like,
Well,
is it that it doesn't care about the numbers? It just estimates the ratio.
Well, I think, yeah, so the point is not that it estimates the ratio per se, because the way that we parameterized it was that it should estimate the two weights separately, right? It is more that given that we are observing binary choices, the information that the model has is only enough to discriminate the ratio. What's the difference between the ratio and the total weight of evidence? That's actually a question that came up last time during class, I think. So the ratio is telling us, who am I giving more importance? The total amount of evidence, today that I haven't brought my bag. Well, the total amount of evidence is actually something about how confident do you get when seeing, let's say, one blue marble. Yes. Thanks. So let's say that, this is the 0 to 1 space. As we see one blue marble, our underlying assumption, belief in the urn, in the proportion of blue and red marbles in the urn, is going to be something like, well, it cannot be 0, but there is a small chance that it is a low proportion of blues, but really there's a lot of probability that the true rate is higher. Well, a lot. There's more probability. If we are not very, if our total weight of evidence is low, right? We don't really believe that much in the source as such. We might have something that's a bit like this, right? It's the one marble is not telling us much. It's telling us as much as half a marble, if you want. If we're over counting, if we are easily swayed by the evidence, right, we might actually have a distribution that is more like a very pointy distribution on the right. this is not just, a mathematical conception. It's an actual phenomenon that has been studied, for instance, in schizophrenia, where there is something called jumping to conclusions, where minimal cues can make the person very confident. And so the weight is important. So the relative weight, the ratio is important. But in a sense, also the total amount of evidence could be quite important, depending on what we're studying. Does that make sense? And what we see here is that only one of these components can be. Why? Because if all that we have is a participant saying yes or no, blue or red, it's actually, this is going to be the most likely value in all three distributions, right? So we're still going to have quite a high preponderance of blue. Right? So what we would need if we wanted to discriminate these cases is, again, maybe a question about the confidence in their decision. And again, we go back to, it's good to do this stuff before we run the experiments, because it tells us whether the information we get from the experiment as it is designed can actually answer the questions we want to answer, right? So if you're interested in the jumping to conclusion, well, I'll try to savage it in a second and see whether we can go another route. But let's say you're stuck here. If you want to investigate something like that, overconfidence, then binary choices are not enough. Right? You want a more graded information source. You might be savaging it using reaction time as a proxy for confidence, but you might, well, of course, you have to have recorded it. And also, the instructions might affect it. If you say answer as quickly as you can instead of take all the time you want, and that gives you different kinds of information. But it's clear that we can't really solve the problem with the task as it is. Does that make sense? Good. So we need to reparameterize. And one possible choice is to say, you know what? It's measuring ratio. Let's just stick to ratio. Right? So we do what it's called a proportional Bayesian agent. We assume that the attention is as a finite sum, right? The more attention you give to your direct evidence, the less you give to the other. Partly because that's what we can record, but it has also some cognitive assumptions. And then what we rewrite is the two weights. One of the weights is P, and the other weight as 1 minus P. If we assume that the overall attention is 1, right? 1 minus P. If we had assumed that the overall weight of evidence was 2, for whatever reason, then here it would be 2 minus P. Right? Where on these scales, 0 to 1, a weight of 0 is no attention, a weight of 0.5 is equally balanced attention, and a weight of 1 is exclusive attention to one of those. However, we might be stubborn and say, no, we actually also care about the total amount of evidence. Let's see if we can trick the model by reparametrizing things and recover both anyway. Well, we have what it's called, well, not what it's called, what I call the reparametrized weighted Bayes agent. So we separate the two terms, one that is about the ratio and one that is about the total amount of evidence, right? Let's see if telling the model that these two are two separate things help the model estimate it. So the ratio is defined as the weight for direct, I made a typo there, divided the weight by direct plus the weight by social, right? which simply means what proportion of the total amount of evidence across the two weights is covered by these first source of evidence. And the second is the total amount of evidence, which is simply the two weights summed up. Right? Now we have two different parameters. One we call it rho, the ratio, and one we call it kappa, the total amount of evidence. And we derive the weights from those underlying parameters. Does that make sense? It's exactly the same information that we had in the previous model, not the proportional, but the previous weighted Bayes. We just explicitly tell the model that the way that this parameter works is not that the two weights are independent from each other, but that there is a ratio and that there is a total amount of evidence. Does that make sense? These also tells us that high kappa, so a high total amount of evidence, leads to deterministic behavior. We've seen, right, that even with minimal cues, we would be very confident. And a low kappa, a more probabilistic behavior. Yes?
It's just to do with the assignment in relation to this.
Yes.
Because you stated we should do a WBA model.
Yes.
Choose one of our own. When you state the WBA, is this reparameterized one, or is it the one you had before it was reparameterized?
Well, the other doesn't give you the true parameter values, right? So we couldn't recover the weights.
Yeah.
So ideally it would be this one, right? It wouldn't be a fail if you implement the other. So in the forward model, it doesn't, it's the same.
Yeah.
It's in the inferential model, we'll see that it makes a difference in how well it recovers the parameters.
Okay.
Right?
So it's this one you want.
Yes. Okay. And then when we need to calculate the weight for direct evidence is rho times kappa. Right? What proportion of the variance is, or proportion of the weights is explained by weight for direct evidence times the total amount of evidence. And the weight for social is 1 minus rho, so the opposite part, what's left, times kappa. And when we do our DAGs of the models, right, what we have here is that now in the proportional Bayes, we could have drawn, I should have drawn actually WD and WS, but it doesn't really matter in the sense that it's really a rho that determines together with the evidence what our posterior belief is. In the reparameterized weighted Bayes, what we have is that rho and kappa determines WD and determine WS, and then the weights together with the evidence from the two sources give us the posterior belief. Yes.
This might be a simple question, but the kappa, the total amount.
Yeah.
This is like 22. Is this like it's like 7 out of 7 marbles times 2 for both of them, or like what is the actual?
So it is independent on the evidence that you see. It's more so let's say that you see 8 and 3, right? As we've seen 8 and 3. If you have a total amount of evidence of 2, then you're simply taking at face value the 8 and 3. But if you have sorry? It's because if you remember, like the simple Bayes as a weight of 1 for one evidence and a weight of 1 for the other evidence. Right. So the simple Bayes, the simple agent, that is just taking all the values at all the evidence at face value, is the same as a weighted Bayes that has a weight of 1 on both evidence.
So it's 2 is which is your total evidence, the amount. It's like the there's two sets of evidences. It's not the evidence itself from the two sets.
Exactly. It's only the sets, yes. If we had a total amount of evidence that's 4, and the ratio is 1, so the two weights are equal, these would count as if you have 16 marbles on your direct sample and 6 in the social evidence, even if you're only seeing 8 and 3. But you,
The kappa is like the number of sources of evidence.
no, it's if you take all the evidence that you have from the two sources, how many times you counted.
I was 83 and 2. Otherwise, my math's not mapping.
Oh, yeah. So you have, this is n out of 8 is your direct source. And then you have n out of, well, n1 and n2. Out of 3 is your second, is your social source of evidence, right?
Yeah.
It doesn't matter what's inside here, but what we also have that what you see gets weighted, right? The weight is independent on whether this is 8 or this is 1, right? Whether this is 3 or this is 13, right? It's just as once you see the evidence in your hand, how much should you consider that evidence, right? So if this is 1, basically what it's saying is just count whatever is out there and take it. If these were 2, it says actually double count it, like be overconfident. So if this was 3 out of 8, it would actually be as 6 out of 16.
So the kappa, the total amount of evidence, is the sum of your weights.
Yes, exactly. And therefore, of course, I cannot tell you from the kappa exactly how much you're overcounting these because I also need the ratio. But it says, if we take the total evidence, how much are you overcounting or undercounting it? Yes?
So I'm okay. The model original problem is not that it's over parameterized, but that it's a funnel. Or is it also over?
Well, so that's what we're exploring, right? So the problem in a sense is we want to recover the weights, we're not recovering them, right?
Yeah.
How do we fix it? So we go and explore. We see that we have a funnel, so it likely needs to be reparameterized.
Yes.
And we see also that the model has some trouble in reconstructing not as much the ratio, but the total amount of evidence.
Yeah.
Right? So what we're doing now is first in the proportional, we say, well, what happens if we just forget about the total amount of evidence?
Yeah.
And we just fit that model. And in the reparameterized weighted base, what we're trying to say is if we change the mathematical shape of the problem, could we still recover both?
Right. That will only help with the funnel, though, not with the.
Well, we'll see. Yes. Let's see if this works. But yeah, we're still interested in the weight for direct and in the weight for social, but we're just saying actually they are determined through 2 other parameters, and these are the parameters that the sampler should explore. And then we calculate the 2 weights and we see whether that helps us figuring out the weights. Gone. Yes. Okay, let's try to do the shift. For the people of the Zoom, the projector has died. And then we'll see. Something is there. So everybody lies on the floor. Okay. Oh, okay. This is great. Okay. Well, let's see. Well, we have a very hefty dissertation that could be used if it's.
Oh, yeah.
I don't know if that helps. Let's see. Oh, sort of. Okay, let's try. So what we do now is we code these into Stan, right? Just to show you how different it is. And basically we can see that the data is exactly the same because we're not changing anything in the data. In the parameters, instead of having weight direct and weight social, we have a parameter. Well, I called it P because rho looks like a P. Should have been an R, but and then here we have that P has a prior a beta distribution because it goes from 0 to 1, a ratio between the two numbers where we take the lowest, well, that where they sum up to 1 is always between 0 and 1, yes?
Reparameterized VBA, this is the PBA.
This is the PBA, yeah. As very clearly it's up there in the corner, yes. And then what we say is that P is used to weight blue 1, and 1 minus P is used to weight blue 2. So the second source of evidence, right? And the same for the posterior of beta, where P is used to weight the amount of red marbles, totals minus blue, in the first source, and 1 minus P is used to weight the number of red marbles in the second source. Yes.
Why do you vectorize?
Because I use the array, and not everything in Stan is yet optimized for arrays, so it was giving an error. When it gives an error saying, "Ooh, these function as issues with the array shape and requires a vector," then I just transform it to vector to that. There was actually a very fun paper that came out last week by some of the developers of Stan saying, "We tried JAGs. Maybe we should have started with JAGs instead." And it pointed exactly to these as one of the issues. But it was a bit tongue-in-cheek because they're developing Stan 3, so that, yeah, we'll see how that looks like. Everything else, then this is mirrored in the generated quantities, but everything else is the same. Yes?
In R, you like feeder binomial, you like a feeder probability and then take binomial growth.
Yes. Yeah.
Feeder binomial here is it then like for our in time just specify that we need like 8 rows and 7 rows of a feeder by
so these is actually generating the choice of the agent, and the choice is only 0 or 1.
Yeah, so marbles per hour.
Yeah. Oh, yes. Yeah. Then you would specify 8. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Sorry, I forgot. 7.
Yeah.
Because it has to go from 0. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Just a check in the header comment. Jeffrey's price.
Yes. That's because that's an ongoing debate that I had with Josh, where he likes Jeffrey priors because they are so in the, if you take the distribution in probability space of a beta, what you get that a beta of 1, 1 is flat. However, in log odd space minus infinite to plus infinite, the beta of 1, 1 is peaked around 0. So some people, including Josh, have been discussing that since the sampling goes on in log odd space, they would want a flat distribution in log odd space. And if you do a 0.5, 0.5, it's flatter. So they've written papers about that. My problem is that then the prior in 0, 1 space is a U-shaped prior, which I don't like. So to sort of give the Jeffrey priors benefit of the doubt, what I did in the course notes, from where I copied this stuff, is I first produced the plots comparing these stuff, then explored how it impacts the outcome. And it impacts the outcome very little. And so for the fun of it, I kept using the Jeffrey priors in the whole course notes. But it's not going to make a difference. But well spotted, yes. Good. Any questions on the proportional based? So the reparameterized weighted base, again, has no changes in the data. When we look at the parameters, we have rho and kappa. Right? Then something that I should have done in the proportional, and I'll do that when I finish teaching, I do the transform parameters so that we see directly how the traditional weights are generated from these new parameters. Right. So in the previous one, I'll add a transform parameter section where I say weight direct equal P and weight social equal 1 minus P. So we can map them more directly. But here I do the same. Weight direct is rho times kappa, and weight social is 1 minus rho times kappa. Right. We'd have to put 2 priors on the parameters that we have. Remember, not on the weight direct and weight social. They are the derived parameters, but on the parameters that are in the parameter section. And so we put a beta 2 on the row, which is really nothing but a slide is like beta 1, but it more decidedly discourages exactly 0 and exactly 1. And then as a kappa is a number that can go from 0 to infinity in principle. And what people would do is they would put a log normal, because the log normal automatically puts us in positive space. Right? And here I did a log of 0.2 as a mean and a standard deviation of 0.5, which when I simulate puts us in between 0.5 and 5, right? The big bulk of the distribution. As I was discussing with Martin, I think it was last week or the week before, I can't remember, or last week must have been. Yeah. Everybody likes the log normal because it has a long tail. meaning that if your kappa is going to be very high in the data, it's not going to complain, right? It's going to find a place for it in the tail. I tend to prefer, when I'm coding my own projects, a half normal. Not as much because it's a better prior per se, but because it breaks if I have a very high kappa in the data, right? And then it tells me, look, your assumption of where the data should be between 0.5 and 5, say, it's actually wrong because the true kappa, as we can infer it from the data, is further away. Right? And I cannot really accommodate it because well, now I made it very but the normal distribution decays very fast compared to a log normal. Yes.
And what do you do that it breaks?
When it breaks, well, then I say, okay, my assumption was wrong. I need to reconsider my priors.
Oh, but you're not like using it. Like then you would change some of the parameters like in your target code.
No, I would, here, yes. I would say actually it should be broader, right?
Yeah.
Or I should move my expected mean, but it's sort of useful to me as a modeler because it tells me when my assumptions were wrong very quickly because the model fails. While with a log normal, if you're not very careful in looking at all the plots after and realizing that it's really pushing the boundary of the prior, then you sort of, oh, no errors, no problems. I'm going to just skim very quickly through the rest of the process. Yes?
What you notice that's a nice fine prior posterior predictive.
Yes. Yeah. So I would notice it. I would still have to go back and change the prior if I'm being honest. And so I can just as well have it break because then I'm forced to go back instead of saying, I'll just look at it later. Now I'll just keep on building something more complex. Right? And then we have the weight direct times the blue in the first source, blah, blah, blah. Exactly the same. When we go to the generated parameters, again, we have saving the rho prior, the kappa prior, the WD prior, WS prior, and then we can just repeat the same code as there. Yes.
I'm just wondering, can kappa be 0?
No.
But is it allowed to be that in this same thing right now?
Log of 2, does it go to 0? I can remember. It tends not to. Usually what happens is if it samples somewhere there, it will reject that sampling. Yeah. But that's a good point. So if problems would emerge when I start fitting, that would be an obvious place to look. Yeah. Okay, so we run a simulation. Well, we actually feed those two models on the very same data. And then very quickly, I look at what happens at the relation between rho and kappa in the reparametrized WBA. And what we see is that, again, it's not perfect. It still has a tail up there, but at least it doesn't have the funnel, right? It's not narrow on the one hand and broad on the other hand. What these plot is telling us is now estimating kappa and rho is decoupled, right? So the MC sampler can roam freely in the space without having to be stretched according to which direction it's going. But also it's telling us that the rho is pretty nicely defined and the kappa is still a mess, right? So we do like before, we create the 3 scenarios, right? Self-focused, balanced, socially influenced, and we look at how well we're recovering the parameters in these 3 scenarios. Why? because if it fails here, right, even doing the full SBC is not going to help us, right? We can catch it early before we let it run for half an hour. This is the PBA. We see that the weight recovery is, or the P recovery is not perfect, right? But it scales, right? The lowest true value corresponds to the lowest estimated value. The highest true value corresponds to the highest estimated true value. It's not capturing the exact value, but it's capturing their sequence. If we look at the VBA for the ratio, again, we see exactly the same thing. It's not spot on, but it captures the sequence. If we look at the kappa, it's crap, right? So now we know that our smart mathematical trick in itself it helps us recover the weights, the relative weights, but we cannot really recover the total amount of evidence. We can do the SBC just to be extra sure. And here we see the parameter recovery for the PBA. It's not uniform, right? There are certain regions where it's more uncertain than other regions, but it's pretty much on the diagonal. Right? So the relative position of the weights is preserved. When we look at the WBA, again, the rho is not noticeably different from the PBA, but the kappa is hopeless. Right? So our worry that the total amount of evidence could not be recovered has not gone away. When we look at the systematic calibration, you remember, right? We take the so we take a value, we sample a value from the prior, we run the simulation, we fit the model, we take the posterior estimate of the model, we order all these posterior by their values, and then we look in which position is the true value. And then we repeat that 1,000 times, and we would want to have a flat distribution. And what we see here is that even if it's not perfect, all three parameters, so the P from the PBA, the kappa and the rho from the WBA, look as if they're calibrated. And I wanted to bring up this slide because we just saw that kappa is crap in the parameter recovery. Why is SBC telling us that it's well calibrated? It's actually better calibrated than P that sort of really goes close to the edge. So why do you think it's well calibrated? Do you remember what calibration means? Yeah. Yes, calibration is a measure of whether our model is biased, that is systematically higher or lower than the true values, or over or underconfident, right? So estimates which are broader and more uncertain than they should be, or estimates that are narrower and less uncertain than they should be. So this is giving us different information. So the parameter recovery is telling us, is there enough information in the data to reconstruct the parameter value? And this is telling us, not enough information. The calibration check is telling us, are the estimates systematically biased in their value or their confidence? And if we look here, right, there's a bunch that are above there's a bunch that are below, and they actually balance out. So there is no systematic overestimation of kappa or underestimation of kappa. They're all bad, but bad in all directions. Right? Does that make sense? Yes, Christian?
But many of the bias, I just feel like it looks like it's underestimated.
Well, so what if you plot it on a log scale, it's easier to see because here you have a lot of frequency and here you have way fewer values. So what happens is that since there are many here, they're actually on average balancing the few bigger underestimates here. Yeah, it's fewer here because we are sampling the prior, well, from the prior, and the prior is a log normal, which means that there is a long tail of occasional high values, but they're not as frequent as these ones. Yes?
Could we then have like a really nice visual looking recovery, for instance, a diagonal line that was just a bit overestimated at all values, but then create a, even though the model recovery looks really neat or like systematically good, the SBC will then show us that we are like always biasing and therefore having a really bad SBC.
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly. Or we could have that, they nicely line on the diagonal, but they have very small confidence intervals or credibility intervals, and therefore the true value is always on the tails. And therefore the calibration would tell us actually you have a U shape and it's miscalibrated in terms of the confidence or the certainty that you have in your results. Right? And that's why we're doing both. But the smart thing is that as we're running this simulation, we can extract from the same simulation both plots. Yes.
Just a straight line through this circle.
If you run enough simulation, then it should be a straight line, should be a uniform distribution. But I haven't, so I think the highest one I ran was 10,000, and that's not enough to get that's why they put these ellipses in.
What sort of effect are the ellipses holding? Is it if the line is like within it's so reasonable, and if it's outside the ellipse?
Exactly. And they're calibrated, they're adjusted by how many simulations you're running. So the fewer simulation you're running, the broader it is, because what can you say? The more you have, the narrower it is. Yeah. I think there was, yes.
So if you had chosen a different bias,
Yes.
could the SBC have shown that one bias?
Yes, because the calibration is of the full model, right? Likelihood, observation model, priors all together. So if you change the prior, your SBC results are going to change. But think of it like in the most obvious way, right? So imagine that your parameter goes from, I don't know, 0 to 5, whatever, and you put a very strong prior that it's 0.5. Your estimates are going to be clustering around 0.5 because that's what you're telling the model that it is. And that will be a very uncalibrated, a very biased estimate.
I think I'm confused about calibration.
Yeah.
Where as far as I understand it, consistency is the lack of bias.
So we're talking about parameter recovery and calibration.
Yeah.
I'm not sure where you're putting consistency.
I think it's in mathematics.
Okay.
It's consistent if it's not biased.
Oh, okay. Yes. Yeah.
But say if we have different bias.
Mm-hmm.
No way. I think maybe I'm confused about the cumulatives, CPFs there.
Yeah.
Because they show, as far as I understand, they show bias
But don't they also show how good the uncertainties are, like how
Yes.
good the uncertainties are?
Yeah. So the idea is only, since it's a cumulative, only 1% of the true value should be in the first percentile of the credibility interval. Only 2% of the true value should be in the second percentile, and so on and so forth. That's what it's telling us. If you have more than 1% of the true values that are in the 1 percentile, right? Meaning that they appear a lot at a specific boundary, the left boundary, then you would have, this line would go up here.
Yeah.
Right.
And would that be affected by the justifier?
Yes. It probably would be, let me think. So if you have very, well, for sure, if you have a log normal prior versus a half normal, you have way more chances of having true values that do not, because the tail is very long, right? So you're not going to have a very high peak here because your prior is keeping the uncertainty a lot alive.
Yeah.
If you have enough data, it's going to shrink it. But if you don't have a lot of data, you might get that the confidence that you're not going to have a lot of values in the extreme here, a lot of true values in the extreme here, if it makes sense.
It makes sense to me that we could sample this
Yeah.
values that when we use generates the innocence.
Yeah. Oh, actually, yeah. So let me backstep 1 second. So, and then we'll take a break. So the idea is, if we have a prior with a long tail, that's going to impact our calibration plots in 2 ways. The first one is the relative uncertainty of the estimates, right? It allows for more uncertainty to stays, which might affect whether we see like these U shapes or not. The second is that the simulation is going to sample more extreme values. And therefore, we're really going to stress test our model in regions that we haven't really thought through in most cases. Right? So a kappa of 100, where it would be that you see one marble and you behave as if you had seen 100. Right? And that's something that where our intuition breaks. Right? So that's where the priors would impact, both in the relative certainty of the estimates and in where we're sort of trying to see whether the model is calibrated. To that extent, the veterinary group in Finland has actually also developed something that's called the posterior simulation-based calibration that says, well, the prior is telling you something about these a priori space, but really after you've seen the data, your model lives in a very specific region. So you should recheck the calibration in that specific region. And I think I put it in chapter 5 as well. Yes. Is that more clear?
Yeah.
Was there another question before we take the break? Or we'll take after the break then. So let's take a 10 minutes break. Okay. Are we ready? So now, what we have, so we sort of understood what our models can and what they cannot. If total evidence were very important to us, we would go back to the drawing board and redesign our task, or figure out a way to include more information that we have from the participants in the model as is, let's say reaction time or confidence. But since we have limited time, for the purpose of the teaching, what we're going to do is we're going to accept that we cannot really reconstruct kappa and just go to the next step. That is, we have three models: the simple Bayes, the proportional Bayes, and the reparametrized weighted Bayes, which are really nothing but nested models, meaning that all three models can be described by the reparametrized weighted Bayes with specific parameter values. If you have a ratio of 1 and a kappa of 2, you get the simple Bayes. Right? It splits equally the two in two weights, so they become 1 and 1. The proportional Bayes is nothing but the reparametrized weighted Bayes with a ratio with a kappa of 1 and the ratio that can vary. So can we discriminate them? So could we have data sets and use our model comparison skills to see whether we can actually reconstruct which of these three models has generated the data? Normally, right, we could say, well, the WBA should give us the right parameter value no matter what, so it might not make a lot of sense, but we've seen that the kappa is not very good. So could it at least tell us whether the data are generated by a range of parameter values that could be the simple Bayes, or that could be the proportional Bayes, or it's actually outside of that range and we really should keep our weighted Bayes? Does that make sense? Good. So we have three scenarios that we design. SBA mimic. So we run a simulation from the WEA, but with the parameters set as if it's a simple Bayesian agent. So the weights ends up being 1 and 1. The PBA mimic. So we run the simulation from the weighted Bayes, but in a way that the parameter values, the weights, could not be expressed by the simple Bayes, but could be expressed by the proportional Bayes. They sum up to 1. Right? They're unbalanced, so it cannot be SBA, but they sum up to 1, so it can be the PBA. Or an actual VBA in which they're neither 1 nor they sum up to 1. So it cannot be generated by the others. So we generate 1, 2, 3 simulated data sets. On each of the data sets, we fit each of the models. So we end up with 9. Right? And again, this is not the full model recovery that we've seen, but it's a targeted model recovery to start figuring out problems. So the code is in the course notes, but let's look at, we do the LU on the 3 models, on the 9 fitted models, and then we look scenario by scenario, which has the lowest or the best EELPD, right? Expected, oh, I forgot now, log probability density or something like that. 0, it means the best model. Deviations from 0, it means that you lose some out of sample performance, right? Estimated out of sample performance. So when we look up there, we see that the SPA is the best for the SPA generated data. For the PBA mimic, we see that the PBA and the WVA are equally good, seemingly. And for the VBA, we also see that the SBA is even worse, right? But PBA and WBA are very similar. Of course, what we can do is then we can say, let's look at the weights that the models are getting, because they tend to be a bit more nuanced. You remember the weights? If we try to predict the actual outcome, what's the ideal weight that I would put on the prediction of model 1, model 2, and model 3 to get the best prediction? And so when there's the SBA, we get that the SBA gets the 100% weight, meaning if we know the SBA, we don't need to know the predictions of the other models. We don't learn anything more. In the PBA mimic, we get that the winning is the PBA. The WBA is still quite likely, but also the SBA could say something. And if we look at the distinct WBA, we get again that the PBA is best and the WBA is second best, slightly higher than before, but really we would pick up the PBA. Now here, there are a couple of questions that I want to ask you, and I want you to take a minute to think about that. The first one is, given that both PBA and WBA can generate data in the first scenario, why is PBA picked up? Right? The second question is, why is the model so uncertain between the WBA and the PBA in these two scenarios and prefers the PBA in the last? Right? So take a minute. And then we start with the first. How do we explain the first results? Why is SPA best, even if the other models can generate the same data? Yes?
And that's because of penalized complexity.
Yes.
Features in the other one that penalized would be more complex.
Yeah. And also at best, it can generate the same, yes. But the penalization is the true culprit. Yes.
I forgot how was the complexity penalized.
It's penalized because it captures noise in the data, right?
Okay.
So when you then simulate or estimate the out-of-sample performance, you get that the more it oscillates with the probabilistic nature of the data, the less likely it is to accurately predict new data points.
Yeah.
Yeah. But there is no term. Yes. It like in AIC, there would be a term, but in the LU-IC, there's no term. You get it for free. Were there other points there? Okay. Why is in this second model, this second scenario, the PBA and WBA, are they sort of competing? Yes, Cassian?
I'm not sure, but I think it could be because so they can both. In this case, the simple Bayesian agent is out because it cannot explain the data.
Yeah.
It lacks the parameters. And you could think that in the last case, the VBA, it still managed to capture like somewhat something with that really bad content parameter. So that might like push it a bit up, but then again, it's more complex, so that might like push it a bit down. And ultimately, you end VBA because it has this complexity.
Yeah, okay, good. So you're saying there's two things. One is the WBA can explain the data, but it's complex, so it gets penalized. And then when we get, especially when we get here, the reason for which the PBA still wins is that WBA is so bad at estimating kappa that it goes all over the place. Right.
So you cannot wait for that basis.
Also, it has very uncertain predictions, right? Because if you have a very uncertain parameter, when you make a prediction, the uncertainty of that parameter gets propagated throughout the prediction. Yes. So in that sense, from these three scenarios, what we learn is that we can for sure discriminate away SBA, the simple Bayesian agent, but that given that WBA is so bad at estimating kappa, we're not really that good at discriminating between PBA and WBA. Then we want to confirm that. So we generate 50 simulation per model, sampling from the priors. That means 150 simulations, which actually 50 simulation is very low for a paper, but then we need to fit each model to each simulation. So we end up with 450 model fittings. And then we do a confusion matrix, a calibration check, and then we look into misclassifications. And this is something that I'm still working on, so you can be very critical about the plots because I'm not sure they're good yet. This is the confusion matrix, right? The diagonal is the place where we would want all the numbers to be. We see that with SBA, it's 80% that it gets the right model. As you know, it's slightly worse than what we would have expected from here, where it was 100%. But you know, there's a lot of uncertainty involved. It's good to have a lot of simulation for that. When it's generated by PBA, it's mostly confident it's a PBA, but sometimes it's wrong with WBA. And when we get data that's generated from the WBA, it's equally confused that it's SBA as it is with WBA and slightly less with PBA. So in a sense, just looking at that scenario, we were overconfident in the ability of our model. Right? So model recovery is not that ideal. Does that make sense? Yes.
The amount of simulations you made fitting to create this code, is that also what you expect us to do? Because right now we are working from just having literally 5 different simulations.
If I remember correctly, in the task instruction, it says 3 to 5 scenarios.
Yes.
Yeah, exactly. Right. Times the number of models.
Yeah.
Course, yes. Because it takes time.
Yeah.
Good. When we look at calibration, do you remember what calibration was for model recovery? Because I forgot when I was doing these slides, I had to go and look it up again. So the idea is that we look at the weight of the model, and then we say when a model is as a weight of 20%, we expect it to be right 20% of the time. If a model has a weight of 0.8, 80%, we expect it to be the right model 80% of the time. That's the diagonal line. Does it make sense? With these few simulations, you can see that the uncertainty is all over the place, but I wanted just to reiterate that this is, I think it's a very cool tool to use to estimate model recovery. We see that it goes in the right direction, but it's kind of crap, right? Again, if I really cared about this for a paper, I would try to run, at the very least, 20 times more simulations, right? But, well, no, actually, not but. But we also want to look at where are the errors? Like, which kind of errors? Are there diagnostic signatures of the model estimating certain values, and that should tell us that it's probably wrong. So I've been playing with different ways of visualizing. So you're going to see the best three, and I'm not sure they're the best ones. But so we take one model at a time, and we look at where were the true parameter values and which of these combinations of parameter values were correctly identified with the true model and which were incorrectly identified with the wrong model. If we take that the true model is SBA, we can't really see shit, as you can imagine, because there's only one parameter value. Does it make sense? So the weights are 1 and 1, and that's it. So everything is there. Not very intuitive. If we take the PBA, first we see that the true parameter values, they sort of cluster on a diagonal, right? Because the higher one weight, the lower the other. And then we look at where the misclassifications are. And we see that there is really a lot of them exactly at 0.5, 0.5. And they are both SBA and actually the VBA are all over the place. SBA, when it's exactly 0.5, 0.5, given that our models are really bad at estimating the total evidence, 0.5, 0.5 is the same as 1 and 1. So it thinks SBA is the shit, right? Yes?
But that's not really a problem, right? That's just expected.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, because they're the same model to a certain extent.
Is it?
No, but we want to know, right? So these are nested models, so it's easier. But when it's two different models, completely different models, for instance, if we had model everything using log odds versus the beta binomial, then we might expect things to be a bit different.
And then we want to know where the, so to say, like the danger zone.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Then if we look at the WBA, we can see that the parameter values are all over the place, but the misclassification tends to cluster along the diagonal, which again makes perfect sense, right? And we actually okay if the true parameter values are on the diagonal and another model gets picked because they're also already on the diagonal. But we need to verify that then the estimated parameter values are also on the diagonal, right? So it's okay if I get a PBA picked as the, how to say, the true model, even if it's not, if then the estimates of the weights are comparable to the true WBA. Maybe not in the kappa, but at least in the row. Does it make sense?
What are the X's?
The wrong models. So you can see this is the clearest one. You have the circles are the true models. And they're all green because here it's generated by WBA. And then we have that the crosses are red and blue, which are the SBA and the PBA. And I change both the shape and the color because then it's easier to see. Yes.
I didn't believe it. That we are okay with the fact that it misclassifies where the data is coming from, as long as the estimates are fitting with the actual true.
As long as the estimated parameter value, the P in PBA, actually corresponds to the row in the WBA. And that's where the next plot comes, right? So, well, actually, this one was, I was just looking at if we have the winning model independently on whether it's the true model or not, where do the parameters, the estimated parameters lie? And so we can see that when SBA is winning, no surprise, I could have avoided drawing this, but it was kind of checking that the plot was working. Everything is estimated at 1. no matter whether it was the right model or the wrong model. When we have the winner, that's the proportional Bayes, we have that the models are estimated, the parameters are estimated all over the place. The errors are also all over the place, but it tends not to estimate things on the diagonal, because I think that then the SBA wins when they're too close to the diagonal. Yes?
It's similar to one of the last.
Yes.
Curving. So maybe I have to understand it. So if the way that looks like how it works for the two gamers.
Well, so that's a constraint in the model. If we're generating the data with the PBA, of course, the true weights lie on that diagonal. If we're estimating parameter values with the PBA can only estimate them on that diagonal. Yeah. But I wanted to see whether there were portions of the diagonal that were different, and indeed there's when it crosses the diagonal. And then when we look at the WBA, we see that it rarely estimates values that are in the other models domains. And I couldn't really see any pattern there in terms of estimated parameter values that could tell us maybe it's wrong. And then what I did here is I took when we have a model that's wrong, we plot with a dot the true parameter values, and with the arrow where actually the model is pushing them in their estimates. And so there we generate with SBA, and the winner is SBA, so there's no wrong model. Here it's generated with SBA, and the winner is PBA. And what it's doing, it's moving those parameters to the diagonal that we've seen before. That makes perfect sense. When the winner is VBA, it's spreading them out, right? It's systematically overestimating because it leaves lower value to the PBA, which is actually great to a certain extent. Well, this is not that interesting because it always pushes things to 1. Here, what we have that the winner is PBA, it's sort of shrinking things to the diagonal. They're kind of in the same order, though, which is neat. And when we have the winner is the VBA and it's a wrong model, again, it keeps the same ranking, but it spreads them out. So these sort of tells me that really the problem is not the row. The row keeps being good, even with the wrong model, but it's the kappa. So it keeps on confirming what we know, but it's nice to see it from these different perspectives. Okay. So now let's say that this is the stuff we've seen. So we have 3 nested model. We can safely recover the weight ratio with some noise, but not the total evidence. We cannot always reconstruct the right model due to total evidence of kappa, but the misclassifications tend to preserve the row to a certain extent. Yes.
What you've just gone through.
Yeah.
Is that the model comparison part of the assignment, or
no? This is extra stuff.
Okay.
There is a minimal part of model comparison, which is you take the scenarios, 3 to 5 scenarios, and then you see how it works out, and you think the scenarios carefully, and that's what I'm asking you. And then I'm saying, if these were a master's thesis, right, I would ask you to actually go the extra step, and that would mean systematic model comparison. And everybody stops here. And I'm getting very dissatisfied with that because it doesn't tell me enough. And so I've been exploring, thanks to the course, different ways of looking at these issues, right? So how much can I trust the weights more than the just binary choice? And can I actually look at the parameter values and see something there? And I think I can see something, but I think it's still in the work. Yes, and here I think that if you're here only to solve the assignment, then you can stop listening for the next 10 minutes. But what I wanted to show is where should we go now? If we were honest, where we would go, we would try to figure out whether kappa is interesting at all. And if it's interesting, we should go back and redesign the task. But we might be stubborn and say, but what about hierarchical modeling, right? Could we gain the extra information that we need from the other participants, right? By combining information across participants. And so here I simulate 20 agents that vary along the same population level parameters, a kappa of 2 with a standard deviation of 0.6 and a ratio of 1 with a standard deviation of 0.3. The two parameters at the individual level are correlated, meaning that the higher your total evidence, the lower your ratio, and vice versa. I plot them. They're nicely distributed on the space in terms of weights. Right? So I take the rho and the kappa and I generate the weights, and then I plot on the x-axis the weight for direct evidence, on the y-axis the weight for social evidence, and we can see that they're nicely spread out. Then we need to change our stand model, well, our simulation model, and then our stand model, so that the data section accounts for multi-level data, and the parameter, transform parameter, and model accounts for the hierarchical parameters, meaning there is an individual plus population level, that the individual level estimates are z-scored, because we've seen that that helps the model fit, and adding a correlation between parameters. And once we've done that in the parameters, transform parameters, and models, we need to replicate the same logic in the generated quantities. So this is the multi-level simple Bayesian agent. Nothing happens except I put a new square called J agents around. We have that what changes in the data is that we have an agent ID, which basically says per each row in the vector which agent it is. So I made it long format. We don't have the hierarchy because there are no parameters. Right? It's a model without parameters. I don't need to change anything else. We can still fit it to the data. When we look at the reparametrized weighted Bayesian agent, what we have now is that on top of the rho and the kappa, I'm putting population level parameters, the mu of rho at the population level, the sigma of rho at the population level, the mu of kappa at the population level, the sigma of kappa at the population level, and an omega term that says that they're correlated. And so the data is the same as in the multi-level simple Bayes. Now in the parameters, what I have is two mu's, two means, the population means for rho and kappa, two sigmas for the two. We have a correlation parameter, and then we have a normalized vector by participant that I called Z for making it very short. Then what we have here is that in the transform parameters, we say that the theta rho, so the actual individual level parameters, have to be reconstructed by multiplying the Z by a scaling parameter, which is now not just the sigma of one of the two parameters, but by a Cholesky matrix, which is really about making sure that the correlation is preserved. Right? We have then a vector of rho a vector of kappa, a vector of weight direct, and a vector of weight social, which we can then put in the model. And then here we have that the rho for participant J is given by the mean of rho plus the deviation of that participant for rho, then pass through the inverse logit, because rho is a 0 to 1 parameter. The kappa is the mean of the population for kappa plus the deviation of that participant passed through an exponential because of the log, right? It's a positive value. And then the weight direct is the rho of that participant times the kappa of that participant. The weight social is 1 minus rho, blah, 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 right? When we then go to the model, of course, we need to change a few of the priors, but the only change we do to the calculation of alpha post and beta post is that we need to specify that the weight direct and the weight social is by agent with J. So we fit it. We look at how well the model recovers the true parameter value. I'm going to explain the plots in a second. And how different would the mean across the single agent models be from our estimate? So up here, we're looking at a true population mean for rho, which is the dashed black. The unpooled estimates is we fit the single agent models to each agent separately, and then we do a mean. And we get something that's pretty much spot on, right? The blue one is the estimate that we get from our multi-level model, which is spot on in terms of the mode. It's actually quite overconfident, right? But why is that? Because it's basically calculating the standard error instead of the standard deviation, which we do when we have the single participants. When we look at the kappa, we see that the unpooled estimate is really far off. And our, in red, hierarchical model is underconfident, but it's capturing the mode of the kappa. So it seems to be doing slightly better on one simulation than what the single agents were doing. Here is just a different way of visualizing it, where we have the true is the red cross, the unpooled is the diamond, and the circle is the true one to the hierarchical one, just to see which one is closest to the true. We look at the single individual parameter estimates, and again, they are, the diagonal is where they should be. The empty dots are the individual level estimates without the hierarchical model, and the full dots are the multi-level estimates for the individuals, which are, for some things, brought in a nicer spot, especially for the rho, but for the kappa, it's really crappy, right? We do SBC, and again, we see that the population level rho is nicely recovered. For the PBA model, actually, I forgot to put that in the previous slides, or I thought to take it out because it was too long. It's not really good at assessing the population level sigma for the PBA. When we move to the WBA, the mean of rho is pretty nicely recovered. Everything else is hopeless, right? So the kappa, which is mu2, is slightly tilted. So we're doing slightly better than before, but it's really all over the place. So we can't really do much with that. So we can't really save it with multi-level. And what I wanted to show, though, is that when we do model recovery, actually, here is where we were before. And with a single agent, and here is the multi-level agent. So we're actually doing better. So we are gaining something, at least in the model recovery. And then we look at the confusion metrics is slightly better again, right? Not fantastically, but it is learning something. Calibration is better. Okay, I'm gonna skip this. Yeah, you can look at it if you want in the course notes. What I did is I took the data that were simulated from 2 different models, put them in the same data set, and then looked at whether our models, what would the models do with this? So assuming that the population is a mixture of 2 different data generating mechanisms. And basically we can do ELPD, so we can do model comparison at the participant level, and the code is in the course notes, and that actually tells us which model is better at participant by participant level, even if we only fit a hierarchical model. Yes, and that's good enough. There's an appendix in the course notes where I do all this fun stuff. Socially reinforced learning, but that's just if you're curious. What I wanted to get you out of these Bayesian cognitive model module is, beside a new set of models, also seeing how the whole set of tools that we covered in the first many weeks actually come together to solve a problem, right? And we'll do that again in the next 3 weeks on models of categorizations. Do you have questions before we close? Yes.
Why, with the multi-level organization,
Yeah.
why did the DBA suddenly beat the FSK on its own?
Let me see. Yes.
I'm sorry, can we maybe
Yes.
stop the class?
Yeah.
Question.
Yep. Absolutely.